So, Cormac McCarthy, if you did not know, was, while he lived, my favorite living author. He passed away in 2023, only rather shortly after publishing in the prior year, 2022, his final works, the set of sister novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris. Now, when I read those books, I said at the time that I regarded them, or The Passenger at least in particular, to be Cormac McCarthy's magnum opus, that it represented the culmination of his career as a writer, even though I readily admitted at the time as well that it was not exactly what you'd call the most perfect book that he had ever written. It was kind of scattershot, kind of overstuffed, you might say, bursting at the seams a little bit. At times it was just kind of all over the place. But in terms of its scope and its ambition, I think it surpassed everything else in his catalog. And I also said that I regarded these books to be the finest of the 21st century so far. So, yes, pretty high praise coming from me when I read these books back then. But time went by, as time tends to do, and I got to thinking to myself, I should probably reread The Passenger and Stella Maris and see if I would still feel the same way about them, if they would still receive the same level of acclaim from me as they did initially, to see if I would still regard them as highly as I did. So that is what I have done. I have reread The Passenger and Stella Maris, and I am here to say right now that yes, they resoundingly did hold up, to me anyway. I do still regard these books, or The Passenger, like I say in specific, to be Cormac McCarthy's magnum opus, the book that went the hardest and reached the farthest of anything that he ever wrote. And I still do hold these books to be the finest of the 21st century so far. And it's really no contest. Like, it's really not even close. These books are not soon to be surpassed, I think. I do still regard them as just absolute masterpieces. But in rereading them, I also wanted to kind of do a deep dive into them, perhaps deeper than I did the first time I read them. And so I have tabbed these books. That's right, that is the first time I have ever done that. Reading a book, I've never used tabs before, but I did with these books because I think these books merit the tabs. So what I plan to do here today is just to go through the books tab by tab and read the things that really left out at me, that really stuck with me, and comment upon them, and to kind of discuss what the books mean overall, because these books mean a lot. They're about a lot of stuff. They're very, very deep. They're about God. In fact, they're kind of anomalous, I think, in that you don't see that many books nowadays that really engage with the idea of God, not like in a necessarily religious sense, but in a more philosophical sense. These books are also heavily philosophical, in particular, engaging quite heavily with the notions of idealism. And they also offer commentary on the world, in particular, the atomic age world that we live in. Perhaps somewhat precariously. But anyway, so like I say, these books are very ambitious, I think, and they also are among the most emotionally effective works that McCarthy ever wrote. In fact, I would say they probably are. The only thing that might rival these books in his canon in terms of emotion would be The Road. But other than that, I think these books are definitely the most poignant things that he ever wrote. And so, like I say, I just want to go through them now, tab by tab, reading the things that left out at me and stuck with me, commenting upon those things, and kind of just giving a kind of off the cuff disquisition on these books and what they mean, and kind of what they mean to me, because like I say, these books did hold up. I still regard these as the masterpieces I did when I first read them. And who knows, maybe I might be able to convince you to come around to my way of thinking. So, yeah, without further ado, let's just dive right in with The Passenger. So, uh, I'm not really going to summarize the plots of these books because you can, there's probably any number of other videos, including other videos made by me that summarize these books. So I'm just going to assume that you are already familiar with the story which these books tell, the kind of uh, meandering, not clearly resolved story that these books tell. And even though that kind of irked a lot of readers when these books came out, people were like, the conspiracy never came to anything. It kind of just fell apart and came unraveled. Yeah, that was kind of the point. Like, again, these books are about, in a thematic sense, they're about not having answers to things. They're about not knowing. And so the fact that the central conspiracy that seems to be set up early on in The Passenger never comes to anything, that's just kind of reflective of the book's thematic concerns. To me, that was just part of the charm. But like I say, I'm just going to go on the assumption that you are already at least passingly familiar with the story of these books. So, like I say, we're going to go through here tab by tab, and I'm going to call out what called out to me, if you will. So, literally on the first page, whenever the hunter discovers the hanging, frozen corpse of Alicia Western, it says at the bottom of this page, she had tied her dress with a red sash so that she'd be found. This is interesting to me because later on in the next book, she mentions to the therapist or the psychiatrist or whatever that she did not want to be found whenever she killed herself, which is interesting. Seems to evince a sort of change of heart there. Just kind of struck me because of, like I say, it kind of contradicts something that was said later on in the other book. And then here, a couple pages on, when we are treated to the first encounter between Alicia and the thalidomide kid, or the first, not chronologically the first, but the first that we are privy to. The kid says this: "Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember a young girl on tiptoes peering through a high aperture infrequently reported upon in the archives. What did she see? A figure at the gate?" But that ain't the question, is it? The question is, did it see her? A small bore of light, who would notice? But the hounds of hell can pass through the weam of a ring. Am I right or what? This is, again, something that when I read these books the first time did not strike me, because you won't recognize the significance of that until you get to Stella Maris. Stella Maris, I mean. But that is referring to a kind of central event in Alicia's life, which has great significance in a kind of philosophic sense, I guess. What did she see looking through the high aperture? We'll come back to that because we'll get to it later on in the next book. And then over here, a couple pages later, the kid says, as he's talking in what we think is just kind of garbled gibberish, and much of it does appear to be garbled gibberish, but within that garbled gibberish, there seems to be kind of snatches of some kind of coherence. And the kid says, "Make it quick, Dick. We're in conference." Yeah, a semi-hostile. Right. Base 2. I want to highlight the words that he uses here, base 2, because that kind of plays into something later on in the book. Just remember, base 2 says that. And then we come on over here several pages. Oh yeah, in this scene where Bobby is discussing the Vietnam War with his friend and coworker Euler, Euler says, "I got shot 5 times. How's that for dumb? Wouldn't you think 2 or 3 would be enough? You ought to be able to figure out by then that it probably wasn't good for you. There were guys that just simply walked out of the war." Now, the reason I tabbed that, the reason that jumped out at me, is because I'm not saying that this is a reference, but it definitely could be a reference to the National Book Award winning novel by Tim O'Brien, Going After Cacciato, because that is the actual plot in a nutshell of the novel Going After Cacciato. There were guys that just simply walked out of the war. That, if you've ever read that book, that's what that book is about. A soldier who just decides one day to up and walk out of the Vietnam War. That just kind of struck me because I didn't know if it was like legitimately intended to be a reference to another work of literature, because references to outside works of literature in Cormac McCarthy's bibliography are scarce. Very few, very far between, and I don't know if that was intended to be one. It just could be, I think. So that just kind of jumped out at me. And then we come over here, a few more pages. This is the beginning, I guess, of what you call the second chapter, the second part of the book. Yet another of the interactions between the kid and Alicia. And the kid says this: reality didn't really much seem to be their subject, and they would listen to her comments and then move on. That the search for its definition was inexorably buried in and subject to the definition it sought, or that the world's reality could not be a category among others therein contained. That leaped out at me because after reading Christopher Langan's The Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, it just kind of struck me because that reality is super tautological, right? The thing that you are looking for is fundamentally not different from what you are looking for that thing with. Again, reality is super tautological. This is just elementary stuff, people. If you want to know more about that, read the CTMU. That just kind of left out at me because it seemed to be kind of reflecting that principle from the CTMU, if anyone out there has read that, the super tautology, which is the reality we inhabit. And then later on, Bobby is having dinner with his friend Debussy, who is a transgender individual, and they're discussing pretty heady stuff, as tends to happen in Cormac McCarthy books. But at one point, they say, "Do you believe in God? The truth? Sure. I don't know who God is or what he is, but I don't believe all this stuff got here by itself, including me. Maybe everything evolves just like they say it does. But if you sound it to its source, you have to come ultimately to an intention." Again, like I say, these books are, I think, kind of anomalous for modern times in that they really do engage with the idea of God. And I don't mean like through the lens of faith, but just through the lens of pure speculation. Like, this is not like a Christian novel. This is not a Catholic or any kind of, explicit like creed novel. It's just engaging with the idea of God, if you will. But I like that line: if you sound it to its source, you have to come ultimately to an intention. That's pretty reflective, basically, of what I myself would believe. I don't think everything just got here by accident. It definitely could. Science has proved that it could, but science has not proved that it did, and moreover, science cannot prove that it did. I would say that there is some kind of intention to everything, and that passage there just kind of leapt out at me because of that. Again, it's a book that's concerned with theology without theology, if you will. It's not concerned with religion, but it is concerned with sort of the object of religion. And here later on it says Bobby goes to a church, and it says, "Old women lighting candles, the dead remembered here who had no other being and who would soon have none at all." That is a very important line because that more than perhaps anything else really sums up what the books are ultimately about, and also the way that the books engage with the notions of idealism, which becomes much more explicit in the second book. That that which is not witnessed and that which is not remembered has no fundamental being. Uh, and the dead remembered here who had no other being and who would soon have none at all. It's also reflective of, as the book goes on, Bobby's own uh, fading memory of his sister, whom he loved and cherished so much. That's kind of how the book ends, actually, that when he dies, she dies, because there won't be anything left, won't be anyone left to carry on her memory. The dead only have existence in this world, at least, through the memory of the living. And so when all those who remember someone who has died themselves die, that person can almost be said to have never existed. It's sort of a bleak notion, but that is definitely one of the book's central concerns, I think. And then over here, now this is where Bobby is having lunch with, or having a meal with, his friend John Shedden. And an interesting thing is that John Shedden was actually a real person. Like, literally, that name is a legitimate name of an acquaintance of Cormac McCarthy that he used to know during his days in Knoxville or somewhere down in the South. This is his kind of tribute to a fallen comrade, I suppose. Even though it's not always the most flattering tribute, but the personality of the John Shedden character in these books is quite memorable. And again, it is an actual person that Cormac McCarthy knew. And in this conversation, the Shedden character says some things which definitely goes against some of the established narratives of our day. This is a book which takes place in 1980, but definitely speaks to certain issues, at least in this particular instance, of the modern world. And Shedden says, well, I suppose we're somewhat of a piece. Again, I've encountered no greater mystery in life than myself. In a just society, I'd be warehoused somewhere. But of course, what really threatens the scofflaw is not the just society, but the decaying one. It is here that he finds himself becoming slowly indistinguishable from the citizenry. He finds himself co-opted, difficult these days to be a rake or a bounder, a roue, a deviant, a pervert. Surely you're joking. The new dispensations have all but erased these categories from the language. You can no longer be a loose woman, for instance, a trollop. The whole concept is meaningless. You can't even be a drug addict. At best, you're just a user. A user? What the expletive is that? We've gone from dope fiends to drug users in just a few short years. It doesn't take Nostradamus to see where this is headed. The most heinous of criminals clamoring for standing. Serial killers and cannibals claiming a right to their lifestyle. Now, that seems, at first glance, perhaps rather alarmist, sort of hyperbolic. But really, it's not. It is not even in the slightest bit hyperbolic, and it definitely is speaking to things that we're seeing now in our world more so than anything we saw in 1980. I guess the germs of what we see now were being planted back in 1980, but it's definitely, like I say, speaking to our world of today. And if you want to slip in commentary like that definitely flies in the face of the traditional narratives of our time, you got to do it with a certain panache, and you got to do it quickly and get it under the radar, so to speak. But what he's saying here is that language will be used to relax moral standards, because language can be used to manipulate thought. Now, that is not to say that thought doesn't precede language, but only that language can be used to a certain extent, at least, to mold thought. And we definitely see that right now, where the word pedophile is being phased out in favor of the new term minor attracted person. Now, you may think that's rather innocuous, but I can assure you it is not, because what is happening is that the aberrancies of the past are slowly becoming the norms of the now. And we've seen that in other ways too, as he points out with drugs. Used to be, if you were a drug addict, you were a faulty individual, that you had a flaw in your character and you made some bad choices, and your life was the result of your own hamartias. But now we don't really view drug addicts as the creators of their own misfortunes. They are rather victims of forces beyond their control, and so we now refer to them as users instead of addicts because it goes down easier. It's not so offensive, but also it relaxes the taboo that used to exist with drug addiction, to where now it's no longer a failure of character, rather it's a disease. And so we see, as I said, the aberrancies of the past become the norms of the now, and you're definitely seeing that again with that minor attracted persons thing. If you don't think that pedophilia actually can be normalized, that like consent age can be lowered to fit the taste of certain deviants, then you better get your head out of your ass, because that's happening. It's coming unless certain things change. And yeah, so don't be surprised, because the world we live in now is one that should surprise nobody with some of the things we've seen. But going on from that, we have over here a few pages. Shedden is relating back to Bobby a dream that Bobby had and told to Shedden, and he says to the description of the dream: "You told me of a dream once that you may or may not remember. Rather curious. We were moving along a stone wall in a slurry of ash, a scene of ruin. There were dark flowers hanging over the wall, carnivorous flowers, you thought them, black and leathery in appearance, like a dog's expletive, you said. We sat in the rubble waiting. Finally, a phone rang. Do you remember? Yes. I answered and listened, and then I said no, and then I hung up the phone. And in the dream, you asked me what they had said, and I told you that they wanted to know if we knew anything about them, and I said no, and they said we didn't think so. And then they hung up. You were the dreamer, yet if I'd not told you what they said, would you have known? I don't know." That is also, that ties in with one of the main preoccupations of the books, which is the unconscious and the way that it relates and communicates with the conscious mind. But also it harkens back to a scene from McCarthy's previous book, Cities of the Plain. And in the final section of the novel Cities of the Plain, the character Billy Parham converses with a mysterious stranger who may or may not be death incarnate under an overpass, and this stranger tells Billy the tale of a dream, and more than that, a dream within a dream, and questions how the character within the dream can know that he is a character within the dream unless certain things are communicated. It's complicated, but in the context of The Passenger, it is engaging with notions of the unconscious and how the unconscious mind operates, how there can be aspects of our own persona which are alien and unknown to us as individuals, but also, like I say, it is kind of a callback to a previous scene from a previous McCarthy book, in particular Cities of the Plain, where it questions how information in dreams can be grasped in a sense, if you will. Just interesting little scene there. Then we come over a few more pages, and then we have a discussion, one of several discussions about physics and science. These books are in large part just vehicles for McCarthy to talk about the subjects that interested him. And while I get that pissed off a lot of people because he sacrificed narrative thrust for pontificating, but hell, I like the subject matter of these books, so I was okay with it. But in this conversation about science, Bobby says, the reason for point particles is that if you stick something ugly in there, such as physical reality, the equations don't work. A point devoid of physical being leaves you with location, and a location without reference to some other location can't be expressed. Again, space only exists as regards objects which inhabit space. Again, this is some kind of like Kantian stuff, I believe you might say. If no object existed in space, there would be no space. That's why prior to the Big Bang, it's kind of a mystery what there actually was, because our conception of space is space between things. That like space is intrinsically tied up in the existence of things. If nothing exists, then there is no space. Really, that's kind of what I think is being said here. But he goes on to say, some of the difficulty with quantum mechanics has to reside in the problem of coming to terms with the simple fact that there is no such thing as information in and of itself independent of the apparatus necessary to its perception. There were no starry skies prior to the first sentient and ocular being to behold them. Before that, all was blackness and silence. Now, I noted that for a couple of reasons. One, because again, it is very, very idealistic in terms of its philosophical perspective. Two, it ties in with another thing which is said by Alicia in Stella Maris. But it also is kind of blurring the lines between physics and metaphysics. Quantum mechanics, as we all know, is a very spooky field, spooky action at a distance, you might say. And a lot of people do think that there is, the kind of observer effect. Now, it should not be thought that human consciousness is actually necessary for the performance of quantum phenomena. But some people do actually believe that. John Wheeler, in particular, is a physicist who actually did believe that, like, human consciousness is fundamentally necessary for the operations of the universe. Interesting stuff if you want to look into that, the participatory universe, or again, if you want to look into the CTMU by Chris Langan, the M equals U principle, or the M equals R principle, mind equals reality, in other words. But there were no starry skies prior to the first sentient and ocular being to behold them. Again, very preoccupied with idealism, which becomes much more explicit in the second book. But the things that we behold are beheld to the beholders, right? Again, tautological it may be, but it is true nonetheless. What is a starry sky except something in relation to something that can see that starry sky? This is once more just tied in with the book's main themes of there being a necessity of a witness, of a beholder, for anything to have coherence, or really perhaps for anything to be, period. That really jumped out at me because, again, it blurs the line between physics and metaphysics, but it's also speaking directly to some of the book's main concerns. Then we come over here a few pages, and we have another callback to the kind of the church scene, the dead who would have no being once all the people who remember them are gone. And this is when Bobby has gone back to his grandmother's farm, his family farm, and he says, or the narration says, a few more years and his grandmother would be gone and the property would be sold and he would never come here again. The time would come when all memory of this place and these people would be stricken from the register of the world. Again, once the people who remember something are all gone, the existence of that something becomes rather tenuous, at least from a certain perspective anyway. That's just another callback to the previous thing that I had pointed out with the church scene. Then we come over here a few more pages, and now I highlighted this part not because of any necessary thematic or philosophic significance, but because it highlights a difference in the Passenger between pretty much everything else in Cormac McCarthy's oeuvre. Bobby is talking to his grandmother, and his grandmother says, "I'm all right, Bobby. Don't pay no attention to me. I get lonely sometimes is all." She turned and looked at him. "Do you ever?" He wanted to tell her that he knew no other state of being. "Sometimes," he said. Now, you might read right over that and not think that there's anything terribly remarkable in that passage, but I assure you that there is, because that is a watershed moment in the bibliography of Cormac McCarthy, because he is actually, can't believe it, but he is actually informing us of a character's interior thoughts. Like that has pretty much never happened in a previous Cormac McCarthy book. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that in Cormac McCarthy's body of work, character has often been the weak spot. because the characters in Cormac McCarthy's books are almost entirely opaque. He virtually never gives us any direct insight into their mindsets. He never relays their actual thoughts to us, but he does here. He wanted to tell her that he knew no other state of being. That is really like a watershed moment in McCarthy's oeuvre, because he is actually giving us real insight into the character's mind. And that's why previous McCarthy books, most notably Child of God and Suttree, those books are essentially character studies, but they are character studies which, in my opinion, fail pretty hard as character studies, because once again, the characters in the books are so opaque. You don't get any like inside look at why they do what they do. All you see is what they do, their actions, but you never get any glimpse into the reasoning behind their actions. But you do hear this is a very significant moment in Cormac McCarthy's body of work, because he's actually showing us inside a character's head. A lot of people may have just read over that and not noted that, but I think that's a very remarkable instance in not only this book, but any Cormac McCarthy book. And now we have Bobby dreaming of his dead sister, and the book reads, "In his dreams of her, she wore at times a smile he tried to remember, and she would say to him almost in a chant words he could scarcely follow. He knew that her lovely face would soon exist nowhere save in his memories and in his dreams, and soon after that, nowhere at all." Once again, a call back to the earlier sentiments from the church and the farm thing. Once everybody who knows a person who has died is dead, that person no longer has any existence in this world. Again, it's just kind of a through line throughout this book of the necessity of a beholder, of a rememberer, you might say. And it goes on to say, "She came in half nude, trailing sarcenet, or perhaps just her Grecian sheeting, crossing a stone stage in the smoking foot lamps, or she would push back the cowl of her robe, and her blonde hair would fall about her face as she bent to him where he lay in the damp and clammy sheets, and whisper to him, 'I'd have been your shadow lane, the keeper of that house alone wherein your soul is safe.' And all the while a clangor like the labor of a foundry, and dark figures in silhouette about the alchemic fires, the ash and the smoke. The floor lay littered with the stillborn forms of their efforts, and still they labored on, the raw, half-sentient mud quivering red in the autoclave. In that dusky penetralium they press about the crucible, shoving and gibbering, while the deep heresiarch, dark in his folded cloak, urges them on in their efforts. And then what thing unspeakable is this rays dripping up through crust and calyx from what hellish marinade?" He woke sweating and switched on the bed lamp and swung his feet to the floor and sat with his face in his hands. "Don't be afraid for me," she had written. "When has death ever harmed anyone?" There's a lot in that scene, a lot that I don't fully grasp, but which I could, and which some readers have made some inferences based upon. For one, I just want to point out the word shadow lane. It's pretty much par for the course with Cormac McCarthy books that you're going to get some cray-cray vocabulary, and The Passenger is no exception. I have never seen the word shadow lane in my life. I actually looked that word up after reading this book the first time. I could not find that word anywhere. It may be an invented word, but something makes me wonder if that actually is. So strange word there, but there's also this imagery of some kind of like Frankenstein process of like molding living figures out of a hellish marinade. Perhaps a kind of a reference to like the Genesis account of man being made out of clay and whatnot. Possibly that, but also some people have speculated that this may be a reference to a potential child that was conceived between Bobby and his sister incestuously. That also, there's another mention of something that really makes you think about that, because we know that there's a romantic element between Bobby and Alicia, and on her part, as is very explicit in Stella Maris, it was very carnal. But on his part, seemingly, it was merely platonic. But this kind of calls that into question. This may be kind of alluding perhaps to a child. Maybe, I don't know. That's just one interpretation that you can maybe give it, in which some people have given it. We come over here a few more pages, and we have yet another interaction between the thalidomide kid and Alicia. And the kid is saying some things more kind of gibberish. And he says, in spite of everything that you've read, some things really don't have a number. But it's worse than that. Some things don't have a designation at all, of any stripe. Well, how can that be, she asks. Well, simple enough, says the small gowned person of unflappable demeanor. The name is what you add on afterwards. Afterwards of what? Afterwards of it appears on the screen. Your screen, my screen, we all screen. We got some herky-jerky images of dudes and dudesses, but they got no name. They used to have names, but they don't anymore. The last witness who could have put a name to the faces is boxed up in the ground alongside them, and if not nameless as well, will soon be so. So, who are they? The fact that they once walked about in the nomenclative mode is small comfort. Small comfort to whom? Well, shit. You just throw up your hands. You don't have to have a name, you say. Okay, don't have to have a name in order to what? This is a callback once again to the, like I said, the kind of through line through the books of the necessity of mind for things to be, in a sense. But it's also, I think, referencing or potentially referencing a scene from yet another prior Cormac McCarthy book, which would be Outer Dark. There is a conversation between the character of Culla in that book and the three mysterious and very, very sinister strangers in that book, where the lead stranger asks him something I can't recall off the top of my head, but something about the people in hell. That says the people in hell don't have any names, but then they had to be sent there, or something like that. I would encourage any Cormac McCarthy fans or aficionados to go back and reread that section out of Outer Dark in conjunction with this passage from The Passenger. Like I say, The Passenger does, I think, represent the culmination of McCarthy's career as a writer. And I think that's very apparent in scenes like this, which are potentially directly referencing things from previous books. In this case, the necessity of names, but the fact that a name is fundamentally something which is linked to sentience, to a mind. Again, there's that scene in Outer Dark about people in hell being nameless, but they had to have a name to be sent there, something like that. Then we come over here further on in the book, and we have this scene, yet another conversation between Bobby and John Shedden, and yet another allusion to idealism, where Shedden says, it's just that the passing of time is irrevocably the passing of you, and then nothing. I suppose it should be a comfort to understand that one cannot be dead forever, where there's no forever to be dead in. Well, I see your look. I know that you see me enfettered in some cognitive morass, and I'm sure that you would contend it to be the ultimate solipsism to believe that the world ceases when you do, but I've no other way to look at it. Every day is doomsday to somebody, because, again, if you subscribe to idealism, there is no real distinction between the world ending and your own dying. The switch is turned off one way or the other. You have no more knowledge of the world. You have no more knowledge of yourself, presumably. And so, again, like I would reiterate, every day is doomsday for somebody, because it may be that there is no distinction between the end of the world and the end of you from an idealistic standpoint. Then we come over here, some more pages, and this is this is the scene in which Bobby is conversing with the thalidomide kid. Now, this is a major, major, major watershed moment in Cormac McCarthy's body of work, because this is explicitly supernatural, or so I interpret it to be. I know some other readers might not have interpreted it this way, but then again, I don't really know how you can interpret this other than any kind of like supernaturalism. Like other books in Cormac McCarthy's bibliography had potentially supernatural elements in them. Outer Dark, definitely. Blood Meridian, for sure. But there's always an out with those. Like, it could be that the three scary strangers in that book are just some evil strangers. It could be that they have a deeper significance, more supernatural significance. In Blood Meridian, it could be that Judge Holden is some kind of devil incarnate, super physical entity, or it could be that he's just got some really good genes and a really good mind in that book. But there is no way out of this as far as I see it. This is explicit supernaturalism when the kid comes to visit Bobby after Alicia has died. But here is what he says, and I would again refer you back to what I said almost at the very beginning of the book, where he says, some evil little shit from some heretofore unknown hinterworld to ferry Data back to base 1 to gear up for the big one. That just jumped out at me because he mentions base 2 earlier on in the book, and then he says to ferry Data back to base 1 here. I don't know exactly what the significance of base 2 and base 1 is, but it did stick with me because it seems to be that there is some kind of cogency to those words, that there is some kind of cogent point there to be made. Base 2, base 1, I don't know. Maybe he's talking about like higher levels of reality or something like that. Or, in mathematics, there is such a thing as base numbers. You can have base 1, base 2 in terms of like again, base numbers. I don't know if that would apply here, but given that these books are heavily concerned with mathematics, it might, I don't know. And from that, we have Bobby asks the kid, what did Alicia know? Saying, what did she know? She knew that in the end, you really can't know. You can't get hold of the world. You can only draw a picture, whether it's a bull on the wall of a cave or a partial differential equation. It's all the same thing. And again, that's kind of like maybe the book's biggest preoccupation is the unknowability of the cosmos. That's there is a remove between us and the world, which may be unbridgeable, that you never can really know. Like, you don't know why things are, you don't know where they came from. Again, the according to Heidegger, the fundamental question of metaphysics is why there is something rather than nothing. And again, it's kind of an unknowable question, perhaps, an unanswerable, or at least an answer that may not be able to be a question that may not be able to be answered conclusively. But also, this alludes as well to a distinction between the territory and the map, and that also becomes much more apparent in the follow-up book, that you're never dealing directly with the world, but only your representation of the world, whether that be a picture or also whether that be a language, and that again comes into play in Stella Maris. But it also, that is, as I said, kind of reflecting why I think anyway the book does not come to much in the sense of its plot. There's a lot of people, when these books came out, they were expecting apparently some kind of like straightforward thriller novel, and like if you were expecting that, like you were bound to be disappointed. Like even No Country for Old Men, which is like the most mainstream thing McCarthy ever wrote, almost the most mainstream thing at least, even that book went out of its way to subvert expectations. Like it was anything but a typical thriller. It kind of broke all the rules while still managing to be somewhat within that framework. But this is no different here. You can't really know, and that's, I think, why the conspiracy, which is so forceful in the early pages of the book, kind of just peters out into nothing. Because you're never going to figure it out. Like you were in the grip of an existential conspiracy simply by existing, because your existence bears with it so many unanswered and potentially unanswerable questions. So, coming on further, we also have these conversations between Bobby and the lawyer named Klein, which he hires or intends to hire, quasi hires for his defense against the IRS or whatever government agency is bedeviling him. And in this particular conversation, they say, "Happy days. What else have you got in the way of good news? You shouldn't despond. Information and survival will ultimately be the same thing. Sooner than you think. What else? Difficult to say. Electronic money. Sooner rather than later. Okay. There won't be any actual money, just transactions. And every transaction will be a matter of record forever. You don't think people will object to this? They'll get used to it. The government will explain that it will help to defeat crime, drugs, the sort of large-scale international arbitrage that threatens the stability of currencies. You can make up your own list. But anything that you buy or sell will be a matter of record. Yes, a stick of gum. Yes, what the government hasn't figured on yet is that this scheme will be followed by the advent of private currencies, and shutting these down will mean rescinding certain parts of the Constitution." This might not be the most philosophically profound moment in the book, but it is definitely burningly pertinent to our world of today. And again, that's what I said before. This book takes place in 1980, but it's retroactive, like futurism. Like, it's fundamentally dealing with our world of today, even though it's set in a prior era. But digital currency is a very, very important and very, very relevant issue to the world of today, because they pose, or at least CBDCs in particular, specifically, pose perhaps the largest threat ever yet devised to freedom, to individual liberty, because with the advent of CBDCs, that is pretty much the death knell of freedom, if it is ever implemented to its fullest extent, that there will be no more freedom with that. You cannot have freedom in a broader sense without having freedom in an economic sense. A lot of people have wanted to contest that historically, but it is a fact that all freedom is intertwined with economic freedom, and CBDCs, digital currency issued by the central government, is the death knell of all freedom. If and when those become de rigueur, you will be officially living in a dystopia, if we can't already be said to live in one at present. Then we come over a few pages, and this is just a neat little line in the book, which, like, this is definitely a callback to Blood Meridian. I think Bobby is walking down the street, and the book says, "He walked down the street and crossed the railroad tracks, the redness of the evening in the glass of the buildings." Again, the subtitle of Blood Meridian is "The Evening Redness in the West." Like, I refuse to believe that that was just a coincidence. That's definitely an explicit reference there to a prior Cormac McCarthy book. Once again, The Passenger is the culmination of his career. And then over here, we have this scene. Again, this is the more explicit scene that really has made a lot of people think that there was like a child conceived between Bobby and Alicia, because Bobby is having yet another dream. And it says, certain dreams gave him no peace. A nurse waiting to take the thing away. What is the thing? The doctor watching him. What do you want to do? I don't know. I don't know what to do. The doctor wore a surgical mask, a white cap. His glasses were steamed. What do you want to do? Has she seen it? No. Tell me what to do. You'll have to tell us. We can't advise you. There were blood stains on his frock. The mask he wore sucked in and out with his breathing. Won't she have to see it? I think that will have to be your decision, bearing in mind, of course, that a thing once seen cannot be unseen. Does it have a brain? Rudimentary. Does it have a soul? Again, there are a lot of people who have read these books think the relationship between Bobby and Alicia did become physical. I could definitely believe that with that scene right there. I definitely could. It could be that that's just like a nightmare of some kind of perverse alternate reality that he's imagining, where like they did conceive a child, which they then apparently aborted. Or it could be that that is actually like a memory bleeding through into his dream. I don't know. It's kind of ambiguous, and I think it's meant to be that way, obviously. But it could be, or it could not be, either way, that the relationship between Bobby and Alicia became more than just platonic. Could be. Then I tabbed this passage here just because it's one of the most achingly sad things that I've ever read in a Cormac McCarthy book, possibly that I've ever read, period. Once again, I want to say that these books are the most emotionally poignant that McCarthy ever wrote, barring perhaps only The Road. Other than that, this is like the top of the pile in terms of emotion. Bobby is writing a letter to his dead sister, as you do, right? And he says, "I don't know what to tell you," he wrote. "Much has changed, and yet everything is the same. I am the same. I always will be. I'm writing because there are things that I think you would like to know. I'm writing because there are things I don't want to forget. Everything is gone from my life except you. I don't even know what that means. There are times when I can't stop crying. I'm sorry. I'll try again tomorrow. All my love, your brother Bobby." Like, that just cuts right to the quick. Seriously, these books are just profoundly depressing, but they're also so beautiful. And that is, again, the skill on display here, is that you can take something so crushingly sad and make people ask for more of it, because damn, that's just beautiful, no matter how depressing it may be. Then we come over here a few more pages, and we have this scene between Bobby and a patient of the mental facility in which his sister stayed, Stella Maris. And this character says, "Well said, history is not a thing. Well said, if problematic. History is a collection of paper, a few fading recollections. After a while, what is not written never happened." Again, just playing right back into the theme of idealism, which is not unique to The Passenger. That is a theme which has been throughout the majority of McCarthy's body of work, even from the start, is the necessity of witness. In The Crossing, there's a character that remarks that acts have their being in the witness, that if something is not beheld, that something really does not even exist. And again, it's just a through line through this book, that where things are not remembered, things didn't really happen, you could say. Some people would say. Cormac McCarthy probably would say. And then we come over here almost to the end of the book, and we have this page here. Now, this is also another instance of explicit supernaturalism on McCarthy's part, where John Shedden, who died earlier in the book, comes back to visit Bobby in a dream. I guess it's a dream, seemingly from beyond the grave. And again, it's definitely meant to be taken as supernatural, because they mention the ghost light in the theater. You can read it for yourself, where you mentioned that the theater can never be dark because there's always the ghost light on. Again, I think that's saying that this is actually a ghostly visitation. But Shedden, who also pontificates along with Bobby in the book, says, "The world's truth constitutes a vision so terrifying as to beggar the prophecies of the bleakest seer who ever walked it. Once you accept that, then the idea that all of this will one day be ground to powder and blown into the void becomes not a prophecy but a promise. So allow me in turn to ask you this question. When we and all our works are gone together with every memory of them and every machine in which such memory could be encoded and stored, and the earth is not even a cinder, for whom then will this be a tragedy? Where would such a being be found, and by whom?" Again, it's playing into the philosophy of George Berkeley, which becomes explicitly called out in the next book, which I'm going to get to, that everything is mental. Again, it's idealism in the most extreme form, immaterialism, if you will, that everything is an idea in the mind. But then you may say, as people have said, as Berkeley addressed in his own works, how can it be that things persist when no one is there watching? Well, because the all-seeing eye, that which watches all, is God. That there is a consciousness which beholds everything at all times, everywhere, in which keeps things, persisting in perpetuity. That we are ideas in the mind of God, if you will. Again, that's very heavily Berkeley-ish in its outlook, but again, Berkeley is called out explicitly in Stella Maris. But that line, where would such a for whom then will this be a tragedy? Where would such a being be found, and by whom? It would be God. That's kind of the implication here, is that all of this is an entertainment for the divine, you might say. Then we come over here to the penultimate page of the work, and Bobby is recalling something that Alicia said to him. In the end, she had said, there will be nothing that cannot be simulated, and this will be the final abridgment of privilege. That is the world to come, not some other. The only alternate is the surprise in those antic shapes burned into the concrete. That is a reference, of course, to Hiroshima, where the people got, obliterated to the point where their shadow became permanent on the concrete in front of which they were standing. But it's that line, there will be nothing that cannot be simulated. I don't know exactly what he's saying there, but again, it's once more evidence that this book, even though it's set in 1980, is concerned principally with the world of today, as we become much more technologically infused, and like the simulation in like the most literal sense of the word becomes like a potentially viable thing to us. Or it could just be that he's maybe saying that like everything is simulated anyway, that again we're just in the cave watching the shadows on the wall. I don't know. It just kind of again leapt out at me. But then we have the final line of the book, and it reads, he knew that on the day of his death he would see her face, and he could hope to carry that beauty into the darkness with him. The last pagan on earth, singing softly upon his palate in an unknown tongue. That is, again, calling back to what the book has previously said about the dead living only in the memory of the living, that when he dies, her face will be the last thing he sees, hopefully, and he can bear that into the darkness with him. But it also says the last pagan on earth. I'm not sure what the significance of that, except I guess he's not Christian. But it could be that he's alluding to the notions that some pagan cultures had of like animism, pantheism, that everything is imbued with some divine aspect. That would definitely kind of call back to the Berkeley notion of God being literally omnipresent, because and that may indeed call back to like the Spinozan notion of God literally being everything. So I just think that line, that part of the line, the last pagan on earth, might possibly be alluding to like animism, his belief that everything is kind of conscious to a degree. I don't know, I'm just speculating here. And then singing softly upon his palate in an unknown tongue. Not sure about the significance of that, but what a way to end the work. So that has been a journey through the many tabs that I put into the Passenger. This is, again, I think, the culmination of McCarthy's career as a writer, and it's still, to me, his magnum opus and the finest single work of the 21st century. And again, it's really no contest. It's not even close. So with that, we can move on to Stella Maris, the companion piece. So Stella Maris is the transcripts of Alicia's therapy sessions during her final stay in the titular mental facility. It's very brief. It's one of the briefest, or maybe the briefest thing that Cormac McCarthy ever wrote. And it's barely even what you can call a novel. It's really much more of a like Socratic dialogue of McCarthy just talking about the things that interested him. Barely anything in the way of plot. And I heard some people say that this really should have been interpolated somehow into The Passenger. that it all should have just been one thing, that this was just like a cash grab kind of deal tacked on to the end of like the main story. And while I can understand that, I would have to disagree. I don't think that Stella Maris should have been interpolated into the Passenger. Like, where would it have been? Like an appendix at the back? I mean, I guess that would have worked, but I really do think it works better as its own standalone thing. Well, it's really not its own standalone thing, but I think it works better as a separate two-piece kind of thing, just because it doesn't detract so much from the story of the Passenger, which is fundamentally Bobby's story. Like, yes, most of the sections in the book, most of the parts of the book open with the italicized interactions between Alicia and the thalidomide kid, but this would have been a little bit much, I think, to put in the Passenger. So I actually am all right with it being separated out, even though normally I'm like the last person to really advocate for a series of books if you can get the story told in one. But this is kind of an exception. I think this works fine as its own thing. So yeah, let's dive right in. Not as many tabs in this as there was in the Passenger. Needless to say, because this is a much shorter work, but let's just jump right in, shall we? So, in one of the seven, I think it's 7 therapy sessions which Alicia has with her psychiatrist. By the way, 7, mystical number. It's the number of completeness, of fullness, the God number. That may be kind of symbolic. I don't know. But on page 39 of this edition, I don't know if it would be the same in all editions, but Alicia says, when I got to high school, the first place I went was to the library. It was just a small room with a desk and maybe 1,000 books, maybe not that, but among them was a volume of Berkeley. I don't know what it was doing there, probably because Berkeley was a bishop. Well, almost certainly because Berkeley was a bishop. But I sat on the floor and I read A New Theory of Vision, and it changed my life. I understood for the first time that the visual world was inside your head. All the world, in fact. I didn't buy into his theological speculations, but the physiology was beyond argument. I sat there for a long time, just letting it soak in. It was hard to avoid the sense that the visual world is the creation of beings with the eyes to do so, not created out of nothing, but out of that something whose actual reality is forever unknowable. Can't. And it is not the case that we can verify the reality of the visual world by reaching out and touching it. For instance, how could it have some contradictory reality? If we were in possession of senses that were in disagreement with one another, we wouldn't even be here. This is the explicit call out to the philosophy of George Berkeley. That is immaterialism, extreme idealism, the belief that everything is a mind quality, that everything is mental, and that the only reason that things exist in any way separate from the mind of individuals is because there is an overmind, an ubermind, that is the mind of God, which oversees everything and keeps everything together and keeps everything in existence. And again, this is really, I think this clarifies a lot about McCarthy's overall philosophical outlook, because like I say, you can see this really throughout a lot of his works. In Blood Meridian, the judge asks the kid, or at that point in the book, the man, if he posted witnesses to all the places he had traveled to in his life to maintain the continuance of their existence, something like that. Again, it's idealism. Does something that you don't perceive continue to be without your perception? If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a noise or not? And again, in The Crossing, one character explicitly says that acts have their being in the witness. So again, this is kind of the call out there that kind of makes clear the worldview, the philosophical outlook, which these books, and really McCarthy's oeuvre more broadly, endorse. So on literally, I think, the next page, I tabbed this. Alicia says, one of the things I realized was that the universe had been evolving for countless billions of years in total darkness and total silence, and that the way that we imagine it is not the way that it was. In the beginning, always was nothing, the novae exploding silently in total darkness. The stars, the passing comets, everything at best of alleged being. Black fires, like the fires of hell. Silence, nothingness, night. Black suns hurting the planets through a universe where the concept of space was meaningless for want of any end to it, for want of any concept to stand against it. And the question, once again, of the nature of that reality to which there was no witness. All of this until the first living creature possessed of vision agreed to imprint the universe upon its primitive and trembling sensorium, and then to touch it with color and movement and memory. It made of me an overnight solipsist, and to some extent I am yet. That is a direct reference to Bobby's statement in the preceding book that there were no starry skies before the first sentient and ocular being to behold them. Apparently, he and his sister shared the same idealistic worldview. I just pointed that out because it in turn points out something that had been said in the previous book. And then we come over here a few pages and we have this statement. Alicia says, I think what most people think, that it's caring that heals, not theory. Good the world over. And it may even be that in the end, all problems are spiritual problems. As moon-minded as Carl Jung was, he was probably right about that. Keeping in mind that the German language doesn't distinguish between mind and soul. I highlighted that passage because when the thalidomide kid comes to Bobby in the Passenger after Alicia has died, he identifies himself as part of Bobby's dead sister's Geist. Geist is the word, the German word for, soul and mind, everything. You can see this in like the word poltergeist. It's spirit in a sense. The poltergeist means noisy spirit, I believe. But the word Geist denotes both mind and soul. And that's a distinction that that's a lack of distinction which is not present in English, because in the English language we generally distinguish between mind and soul. That our mind is the collection of our mental cognitive processes, but the spirit, the soul, is some kind of nebulous other thing which transcends the physical world. But as Alicia points out, German language does not make any such distinction. Mind and soul are pretty much the same thing. I just thought that was neat because it again harkens back to the Passenger, where the kid identifies himself as part of Alicia's Geist. Just thought that was interesting. And then we come over here some ways in the book. And this is where Alicia confesses the thing which the kid references in the very beginning of the Passenger. She says, the doctor says, what was the dream or the vision or whatever it was? And Alicia says, I saw through something like a Judas hole into this world where there were sentinels standing at a gate, and I knew that beyond the gate was something terrible, and that it had power over me. Something terrible. Yes, a being, a presence, and that the search for shelter and for a covenant among us was simply to elude this baleful thing of which we were in endless fear and yet of which we had no knowledge. This is the thing, the event which the kid referenced in the very beginning of the Passenger, of her peering into something, some kind of other realm, other reality. And it's funny because the books don't, this book really doesn't make all that much of it, but I think this is yet another example of how these books are a little bit more daring than McCarthy's previous books, in that they're willing to go into like explicit supernatural territory of her seeing, I guess it's meant to be like God, even though she doesn't call it God. In fact, what she does call it here, just a little ways on, or later on in the book, is, we'll come to that, I guess. But the entire phenomenon of visitations by the kid and all the other horts in the books it's implied, kicked off by her seeing this thing. seeing through this hole into some kind of higher realm or higher reality or something. But we'll come back to that with what she names this thing that she saw. Anyway, a couple pages over, or a few pages over, we have this section. I find it frightening. The void has no stake in the world's continuing existence. Its home is well to countless millions of meteorites, some of them enormous, trundling across the blackness at 40 miles a second. I think if there were anything to care, it would have cared by now. A friend of mine once said, when all trace of our existence is gone, for whom then will this be a tragedy? That friend is John Shedden from The Passenger, because he says, in essence, the exact same thing to Bobby when he visits him from beyond the grave. I just tabbed that because it's yet another reference to the preceding book. And then coming over here a little bit farther over, they're discussing the kid, the thalidomide kid, and the doctor says, I just wondered if he shared your pessimism. Not really, or maybe he took it as part of his job to try and cheer me up. If anything, I was always more inclined to metaphysical musings than he was. Is all of reality devoid of sentience? I don't know, but he would think the question inane. Do you mean that the world itself might be possessed of something like a will? Something like, and would that really be good news, that every dumb creature that ever found itself called into being in order to trek its way across a landscape of pain and want to its ultimate eternal extinction is that will's handiwork? Is there some kind of intent behind things, is what she's asking, or what the doctor is asking. And again, that kind of harkens back to the statement by Debussy in The Passenger, that if you sound it to its source, you come to an intention or an intent or whatever. It's kind of the same thing there, that behind everything there is some kind of will, or so McCarthy would aver, and so I would myself aver as well. Then we come over here, and I tabbed this section because it is a direct rip. It is, I think it is a verbatim lifting from the nonfiction paper that McCarthy published called the Kekule Problem, or the Kekule, I think it's the Kekule Problem, something similarly titled. And Alicia says, psychiatrists have trouble dealing with the unconscious in a straightforward way, but the unconscious is a purely biological system, not a magical one. It's a biological system because that's all there is for it to be. People aren't happy talking about the unconscious unless there's a certain amount of hokum involved, but there isn't. The unconscious is simply a machine for operating an animal. What else could it be? Most of what we do is unconscious. Turning chores over to the conscious mind is a risky business. Whales and dolphins have to time their breathing to their surfacing. So, of course, when they were first anesthetized for surgery, they simply died, which should have been predictable. The unconscious evolves along with the species to meet its needs. And if there's anything spooky about it, it's that it sometimes seems to anticipate those needs. It can't afford surprises. It's one of the things that troubled Darwin. But the soul doctors don't get any of this. They're Cartesian to the bone. Now, in addition to being, I think, directly lifted from the Kekule Problem, or whatever that essay that McCarthy wrote was entitled, this is touching on the notion of the unconscious and the way that the unconscious is a link to an older stage of evolution, I guess, for humanity. The unconscious, we kind of have a schism in our being, right, between our conscious waking selves and our unconscious selves, the level of our being that is sub-thought, that just kind of operates on instinct and performs its functions by kind of automatically, I suppose, and that a lot of people see this as like something mystical, but Alicia avers that it's only just a machine for operating an animal, because at the stage of human evolution in which the unconscious mind was most vital to our survival, we would have been merely animals. So as we evolved, we kind of evolved a different consciousness, that is, consciousness like actual conscious awareness as we ascended the ladder of potentiality, you might say. And then over here on this page, Alicia is talking. Well, I'll just read it. That might not be true, that it is that often right. What's probably true is that only the right answers get reported. At a conference a while back, I ran into the historian of the Manhattan Project, a man named David Hawkins. We got to talking about math, and he told me that what first got him interested in the subject was the second chapter of Spengler's Decline of the West, which is entitled The Meaning of Numbers. I asked him what Spengler's view was, and he said that he wasn't sure. That Spengler seemed eager to make a distinction between mathematics as numeracy and mathematics as chronology, which I thought was already pretty well established in the cardinal and the ordinal, but I assumed that Spengler was after something else. But I got the book and read the opening chapter and a bit more here and there, as with the general run of philosophers, if he is one. The most interesting thing was not his ideas, but just the way his mind worked. I read a bit more before I gave it up, but I thought it one of the more interesting pieces of nonsense I'd come across. I don't think you can call him a crank. He knows too much. And it really is well written. I think I would put him with Schopenhauer as an exemplar of German prose. He makes some odd statements. The mathematics of night, I suppose Grothendieck is capable of saying something like that. But Grothendieck is a great mathematician. You have to take him seriously. Beginning this lengthy study of what he takes to be the meaning of history with an inquiry into the meaning of mathematics is a strategy that modern philosophers might well take into consideration. An enormous amount of Wittgenstein's work is in mathematics, very little of it published. I just wanted to tab the mention of Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West by McCarthy, because even though Alicia here calls it one of the more interesting pieces of nonsense I'd come across, I don't really think McCarthy viewed The Decline of the West as nonsense. I have read that book, that work. It's over here on my shelf. I'm not sure exactly how much of it I buy into. I think you're kind of stepping beyond your ken whenever you try to formulate grand theories of history, and more importantly, predictive theories of history to try to say what will happen and how and whatnot. I think that's kind of beyond the grasp of any one person, but it is interesting because I think that Spengler's work was something of a influence on McCarthy. I've heard that, and as well, you can kind of, given that these works are very pessimistic in their outlook, you could say that these books are kind of concerned with the decline of the West, because there's so much lament about the development of atomic weaponry and whatnot, about how we now have the ability to literally destroy ourselves and the world and stuff like that. And of course, the social commentary that Shedden makes in the previous book about the molding of thought through language. It seemed to be that Cormac McCarthy's perspective was kind of a glass half empty one, that perhaps the West was on its decline. But anyway, I just tabbed that because I thought it was kind of an interesting little topic there. And then on this page, a little ways over, we have yet more direct lifting from the Kekule problem, or whatever that essay is entitled, where Alicia says, the actual issue is that someone 100,000 years ago sat up in his robes and said, holy shit, sort of. He didn't have a language yet, but what he had just understood is that one thing can be another. Not look like it or act upon it, be it. Stand for it. Pebbles can be goats. Sounds can be things. The name for water is water. What seems inconsequential to us by reason of usage is in fact the founding notion of civilization. Language, art, mathematics, everything. Ultimately, the world itself and all in it. That's just more stuff, I think, lifted directly from his nonfiction essay, which is about the unconscious and how the human development of language and stuff occurred like that. Interesting stuff. You can read that if you would like. And then I just tabbed this because I don't think this is correct. So Alicia discusses with the doctor that she had contemplated suicide, and contemplated suicide very intensively, that she was almost going to kill herself, and she was going to kill herself by drowning herself. And this doesn't really have much like, thematic or philosophic bearing on the story, but I did tab this because I don't think it's correct, and I will read it and point out what I don't think is right. She's talking about drowning here, and she says, "You're sitting on the glacial floor of the lake with the weight of the water in your lungs like a cannonball, and the pain of the cold in your chest is probably indistinguishable from fire. And you are gagging in agony, and even though your mind is beginning to go, you are yet caught in the iron grip of a terror utterly atavistic and over which you have no control whatsoever. And now, out of nowhere, there's a new thought. The extraordinary cold is probably capable of keeping you alive for an unknown period of time. Hours, perhaps, drowned or not." No, it is not. I don't know what he was thinking, but your brain can only survive a few minutes without oxygen. So for him to say the extraordinary cold is probably capable of keeping you alive for an unknown period of time, hours perhaps, drowned or not, no, it is not. When you drown yourself, when your brain no longer has sufficient oxygen and you no longer have air to breathe, your lungs are full of water, you're gonna die pretty quickly. That jumped out at me the first time I read these books because it's so flagrantly wrong, or so I think. I do not think you can survive underwater for hours, even if it's cold. I mean, if that was the case, then the people in the Titanic would have been alive for quite longer than they were. I just don't think that's right. The extraordinary cold is probably capable of keeping you alive for an unknown period of time, hours perhaps. I don't think so. You're gonna die after only a few minutes, I would think. So I don't know why he put that in there because I don't think it's medically correct. But anyway, and then on the very next page, he says, or she says, "I'd always had the idea that I didn't want to be found, that if you died and nobody knew about it, that would be as close as you could get to never having been here in the first place." Not only does that tie in with the notion of witness being necessary for legitimate existence, but also it contradicts the first page of The Passenger, where she did apparently want to be found after her suicide and tied a ribbon to her dress so someone would see her. Just kind of an interesting little contradiction there, it seems. And then we come over here a few more pages, and they're talking about the kid. And she says, "I do think that he was sent. Nothing else really computes." And he was sent, I think it's pretty heavily implied in the books, because she saw through the hole in the door to something, which, again, the books don't really make that much of, but it is kind of, it's definitely something in the background there that's worth noting, what she saw through the door, or through the hole in the door. And over here, a couple pages, Alicia says, 8, the Ogdoad. The Ogdoad in Gnostic years. Just an interesting little point that McCarthy explicitly uses the word Gnostic, because his books are heavily Gnostic, or have been, especially Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian is a very Gnostic book. A lot of people may not realize that if they're not really attuned to that kind of thought, but it is a very Gnostic book. It's very concerned with pneuma and stuff like that. So yeah, he's kind of going all in with this book, just kind of laying it out there, some of the things he believes and some of the things that have interested him. And here the doctor says, "Troubling words, but I think you've suggested that the advent of language, aside from the enormous value of it, was disruptive. Very disruptive, of a piece with its value, creative destruction. All sorts of talents and skills must have been lost, mostly communicative, but also things like navigation and probably even the richness of dreams. In the end, this strange new code must have replaced at least part of the world with what can be said about it. Reality with opinion, narrative with commentary." Now, that is a theme that is much more prevalent. It's kind of like of central relevance to the unpublished Cormac McCarthy screenplay entitled Whales and Men, which you can read online if you would like. In that work, Whales and Men, there is an extended conversation about the nature of language and how the human capacity for language is what separates us, in a sense, from animals, and also is what separates us from nature. And that it is because of our separation from nature, which is largely a result of our use of language, that our capacity for destruction comes. Now, I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that, with those sentiments. It's kind of a little more hippy dippy, misanthropic than I'm kind of inclined to. But it's just another theme that you can find in another work of Cormac McCarthy's. Now, I didn't tab it apparently in here, but I want to come back to the thing that Alicia saw through the hole, and what she, more importantly, what she named that thing. Because in the book here, and like I said, I can't believe I didn't tab it. She refers to this thing as the Archatron. And I bring that up because that word is not the first time that Cormac McCarthy has ever used that word. The word Archatron also appears in the final section of Cities of the Plain, in that extended description of a dream and a dream within a dream. There is the word Archatron is used. Now, that word is once again seemingly an invented word, but it has Gnostic echoes to it, because if you are familiar with Gnosticism, archons are central to that cosmology. And the word Archatron is what Alicia terms this presence that she perceives by looking through the hole in the door, in this kind of vision thing that she had. And it's implied, I think, quite heavily, that the hallucinations to which she is prey are sent by this thing, by the Archatron, which I took it to mean that she kind of was given a brief glimpse at, like, God, right? That she kind of briefly saw in a certain way the power that is behind the universe. I don't know. I may be misinterpreting that, but I did want to bring that up because that is not the first time that McCarthy has used that word. It ties in with a previous book of his. But that event is again touched upon in the opening pages of The Passenger, and it is kind of like the driving thing behind her story. Because the kid and the other Horts are kind of like emissaries of this thing, or so I took it. And I think that's backed up by the kid's interaction with Bobby in The Passenger later on. I think it is kind of, again, it's definitely explicitly supernatural, but I think it's certainly meant to be taken that they're like the employees of some kind of higher power. They're like angels in a sense, kind of deformed, physically grotesque angels in a sense. But that's what I took from it anyway. So that has been my deep dive through The Passenger and Stella Maris. These books, once again, held up remarkably well upon rereading, and I could read these books again right now, honestly, because they're that rich to me. They really are. I think they do represent the culmination of McCarthy's career as a writer, and they're the level of ambition and depth that they have is such that you don't really see that much anymore in contemporary literature. And I don't want to be like the doomer that's kind of arguing that culture is failing and that literature isn't valuable anymore, that books nowadays are shallow and pointless. I'm not necessarily going that far, but you don't see many books like these that are really like going for it. They're really shooting for the stars here. And like I say, I totally concede that these books are not the most perfect works that he's written. Like Stella Maris, it's barely even a novel. It's just one man talking about things that interested him through the medium of fiction, which is it's essentially just a glorified Socratic dialogue. And The Passenger is kind of a scattershot book that has characters that enter and exit with no proper setup or denouement. And again, there's just so much in it. It's kind of overstuffed, but nonetheless, the scope of it, what it wants to do, and the nature of the books of them just being like the final testament, if you will, of McCarthy, of his life. I think that their merits more than outweigh their faults. The emotion of the books is beyond that of anything else in his catalog, except maybe The Road. The characters are probably the best that he ever wrote, and that's really saying something because the characters again have so often been the weak spot, the weak point of his books, but not here. They really hold up quite well. These books are achingly sad, they're deeply poignant, and they really suck you in both on an emotional and on a narrative level because these books are just so, again, rich. There's just so much to them, so much that I love about these books. And again, I don't know if I was able to craft any kind of cohesive, overarching theory of the books about what really happens because I've heard some theories about these books that, like, the Passenger is all just taking place in Bobby's head, and that, you know, you might could make that kind of inference because we know from the Passenger that Bobby had an accident, a race car accident, and was in a coma for a time, and that is when Stella Maris transpires while Bobby is presumably brain dead in a coma. That happened. I think that happened in. I think you can pinpoint the exact chronology of these books. I think that happened in 1972, but The Passenger takes place in 1980. Yet more than one character, I believe, says that event happened 10 years ago, which it really wouldn't be 10 years ago. It would just be 8 years ago if that is the case. But I've heard people say that The Passenger is just like one extended dream sequence and that Bobby really is dead, like he's brain dead, essentially in a coma, and that the entire thing, like, you know, everybody hates that twist at the end. It was all a dream. Everybody, that pisses off everybody because it undermines the value of the story that they just experienced if none of it was quote unquote real. I don't know if that's the case. I'm more inclined to think that it's not. I do kind of incline to taking these books at face value that Bobby was in a coma and then his sister killed herself because she thought he wouldn't wake up, but then he did wake up, and so that kind of heightens the tragedy of it. It makes it much more biting of a tragedy, I think. But I recognize that these books do lend themselves to a certain degree of speculation that people can kind of, in a sense, choose their own adventure and say, well, maybe this is what happened. Maybe, you know, this didn't happen like this. I don't know. All I know is that these books are incredibly rich. They are, in my opinion, still McCarthy's finest works, The Passenger in particular. They are, I think, the culmination of his career, and they are, again, bar none, to me, the finest books of the 21st century so far, and they may remain that way. Like, I don't know if these books will be surpassed because I just don't know how many authors are still out there, like, going this hard, like trying to do what McCarthy did. I just don't know how many authors like that we have left. But I'm so thankful that we have these books. Like I say, McCarthy died in 2023, and these books were published in 2022, so he just barely got them out. But I'm exceedingly grateful that he did because I love these books. The Passenger still is among my 10 favorite books of all time upon rereading, and I'm very happy to have it be so. And like I say, I could probably reread these books now and still just have a blast with them because they're just that good. They just don't make them like that anymore. But anyway, like I say, this has been my analysis, deep dive, tabulated journey through Cormac McCarthy's final works. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope perhaps I have inspired you to give these books a chance, or maybe give these books another chance if you dismissed them the first time around, because I know a lot of people did. But I think that's an incredible injustice because these books are fantastic. They kick ass. I love them. So yeah, I rated The Passenger when I first read it an A+. And I would rate these books the same way. I love these books. They are not only the best of McCarthy's career for me, they're the best books of this century so far for me. I'm standing by that. I'm sticking to my guns. So yeah, pick up The Passenger and Stella Maris if you haven't read them. Definitely. If you have read these books, though, let me know down in the comments what you thought about them, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything that I've said here today. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.